A police officer returned to Chicago after years of long shifts and sleepless nights, carrying nothing but the hope of rebuilding his broken home. At his side walked Max, his loyal German shepherd, guarding each step with unwavering devotion. But instead of peace, he found betrayal. His own sister raising her voice against two frightened children, her cruelty echoing through the halls of the house that should have been their sanctuary. With nowhere to turn, a weary father, his daughter, his baby boy, and their faithful dog began a journey through fear, forgiveness, and the courage to start again. What happened next would reveal how love, resilience, and God's quiet miracles can bring even the most fractured family back together. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe every child deserves a safe and loving home, hit that subscribe button, because what you are about to hear may renew your faith in family, hope, and second chances. Winter had settled deeply over Chicago, wrapping the city in a white silence broken only by the occasional groan of plows on the frozen streets and the crunch of hurried footsteps against icy sidewalks. The Carter home stood on a quiet block of Lincoln Park, a red-bricked townhouse with tall windows veiled in frost, looking more like a solemn fortress than a family dwelling. Inside, the air was heavy with an emptiness that even the crackling fireplace could not soften. The Carter family had once been whole here, laughter echoing through the kitchen, soft music drifting from the old record player, the scent of cinnamon rolls that Anna Carter, David's late wife, loved to bake on Sundays. But Anna was gone, taken 2 years earlier in the chaos of childbirth when their son Ethan entered the world, and the house had since surrendered its joy to silence. David Carter, now 42, bore the weight of that silence more than anyone. Tall and broad-shouldered, with short dark brown hair streaked silver at the temples, and hazel eyes that once glowed with warmth but now seemed perpetually clouded, David was the kind of man people instinctively trusted. A police lieutenant in the Chicago Police Department, he carried himself with the posture of a man used to command, yet his step had grown slower since Anna's passing. His face, angular and rugged, was usually shadowed by a short beard, a mask that made him look even more fatigued than he already was. In his uniform, he appeared formidable, but at home he was haunted by nights filled with crime scenes and mornings where he returned to a house too quiet for children. After Anna's death, David threw himself into work. Homicide investigations, drug raids, endless overtime. It was easier to bury himself in other people's tragedies than to face his own. His absence, however, left the true burden to fall upon his daughter Sophie. Sophie Carter, at just 9 years old, carried herself with a maturity far beyond her years. She was slender, small for her age, with chestnut brown hair that fell in untidy waves around a pale, freckled face. Her hazel eyes were her most striking feature, bright and expressive, but shadowed by the weight of grief. Sophie adored her mother and still clutched the silver heart-shaped locket that once belonged to Anna, a keepsake she wore under her sweater as though it contained all the warmth she had left. Despite her age, Sophie had learned to change diapers, rock a baby to sleep, and prepare simple meals. She was both sister and surrogate mother to Ethan, her little brother who had never known the gentle arms of their mother. Ethan Carter was only 2 years old, a rosy-cheeked toddler with light brown curls and curious eyes that followed Sophie wherever she went. He was small but full of restless energy, a little boy who babbled half words and clutched a worn stuffed rabbit as if it were his closest friend. Ethan often tugged at his sister's sweater or held tightly to her hand, depending on her calm presence in the absence of a father's attention. Yet Sophie was not entirely alone. Her truest companion was Max, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat and alert amber eyes. Once a proud canine service dog in the Chicago Police Department, Max had retired after a training injury. David had brought him home at Anna's urging, believing a trusted partner might help keep the family safe. Max quickly became Sophie's shadow. The dog was muscular and imposing, yet gentle with Ethan, lowering his great head so the child could tug at his ears without protest. With Sophie, Max was fiercely protective, often positioning himself between her and the door when unfamiliar visitors arrived. In his watchful amber eyes, Sophie found the steadfast loyalty she longed for from her father. Yet Max could not fill the void completely. On a particularly cold December morning, the Carter house bustled not with laughter, but with preparation. David stood before the mirror, dressed in his navy blue uniform, fastening his badge with the mechanical precision of habit. His reflection was grim, eyes dull from yet another sleepless night. Sophie hovered in the doorway, Ethan in her arms, his small head resting against her shoulder. She stepped forward timidly, her soft voice breaking the quiet. "Daddy, can you have dinner with me tonight?" Her words were simple, but they struck like a blade. David froze, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. In Sophie's gaze he saw Anna, the same softness, the same plea for love. For a moment his chest ached as though he might collapse under the weight of it. But then he looked away, buttoning his coat with finality. "I'm busy, sweetheart. Let's save it for another time." His voice was low, distant, stripped of warmth. Sophie's lips trembled as though she had swallowed glass. She hugged Ethan tighter, letting his downy hair hide the tears streaming silently down her face. David, unable to face the devastation in his daughter's eyes, hurried down the stairs with his briefcase in hand. That was when the sound of heels clicked against the hardwood floor. Entering the hallway was Melissa Carter, David's younger sister. At 34, Melissa was striking in appearance, tall, with dyed auburn hair that fell sleekly over her shoulders, and green eyes that gleamed with a mixture of calculation and bitterness. Once known for her charm, life had recently stripped her of stability. Her marriage had collapsed amid her husband's infidelity, leaving her broke and desperate. She moved into David's house under the guise of helping with the children, presenting herself as the dutiful sister and aunt. Outwardly, Melissa maintained an air of elegance, often wearing tailored dresses that suggested confidence. Yet her sharp cheekbones and tight jaw betrayed tension, and her eyes glimmered with something Sophie instinctively mistrusted. In front of David, Melissa played her role flawlessly. "Don't worry about a thing while you're away on duty," she said, her tone syrupy, her smile rehearsed. "I'll take care of Sophie and Ethan. You just focus on your work. Let me shoulder some responsibility for you." David exhaled, his expression softening. To him, Melissa was the last remaining piece of family he could rely on. He nodded with gratitude, placing his trust in her without hesitation. "Thank you, Melissa. Without you, I don't know how I'd manage." Sophie stood silently nearby, clutching Ethan close, her locket pressed tightly in her palm. She said nothing, but her wide eyes reflected unease. Deep down, something in her whispered that her aunt's smile was not as kind as it appeared. From the far end of the hall, two more figures observed the exchange quietly. Mrs. Helen, the housekeeper who had served the Carters for over 15 years, stood with her hands folded. A woman in her early 60s, short and stout, with silver hair pinned into a bun, Helen had a heart as warm as the cookies she once baked for the children. Yet in recent years, she had grown weary, her once bright eyes dulled by the strain of silence. Beside her lingered Grace, the young maid, only 22, slender and shy, with brown curls that constantly fell into her eyes. Grace had come from a struggling family in the south side of Chicago, grateful for the job but fearful of losing it. She leaned closer to Helen, whispering softly, "Do you think we'll be all right, ma'am?" Helen pressed her lips together, her voice low and resigned. "Keep quiet. She's his sister. We're not allowed to interfere." David heard none of it. Adjusting his cap, he walked toward the front door. "I'll be gone for a few days, maybe longer depending on the case. Sophie, listen to your aunt. Helen, Grace, follow her instructions. I'll call when I can." Melissa's smile widened, tilting her head gracefully. "Don't worry, David. From now on, I'll take care of the children for you. Everything will fall into place." With a faint nod, David lifted his suitcase, pulled open the heavy front door, and stepped out into the cold. The door closed behind him with a hollow thud, the echo of his departure reverberating through the silent house. Outside, snowflakes drifted from a gray sky, blanketing the city. Inside, the Carter home stood still. Sophie's small heart tightened as she hugged Ethan closer, Max's steady presence the only warmth in the shadow that had begun to creep across their lives. The snow had thickened over Chicago by the next morning, burying sidewalks in white sheets and muffling the sound of traffic. Inside the Carter house, however, the cold came not from winter but from the uneasy rhythm that had begun once David shut the door behind him. Melissa Carter, no longer needing to hold her mask of sweetness, moved through the house with a different air. The polished smile she wore for her brother faded into a thin-lipped smirk, her green eyes sharp with irritation. She strode across the polished wooden floors in her fitted gray dress, heels tapping like a metronome of dominance. Her auburn hair, which gleamed like copper in daylight, now seemed harsher under the dim lights, matching the edge in her voice. She was a woman whose pride had been bruised by divorce and financial collapse. Bitterness had carved permanent shadows into her once pretty face. Melissa did not waste time. She turned sharply to Grace, who was tidying up the breakfast table, her soft curls slipping over her eyes. Grace, only 22 and timid by nature, was quick to flinch at the sound of Melissa's voice. "You call this clean?" Melissa snapped, swiping her hand across the table and pointing at crumbs. "Do it again. And do it properly this time." "I don't tolerate laziness." Grace murmured an apology and rushed to fetch a cloth, her cheeks flushing with humiliation. Mrs. Helen, standing nearby with her sturdy frame and silver bun, clenched her jaw. At 62, she had seen enough cruelty in life to know when silence was safer than resistance. Once, years ago, she had been dismissed from another wealthy family simply for questioning the lady of the house. The memory of losing her livelihood and the months of struggle that followed kept her head bowed now. She turned back to the dishes without a word, though her heart ached for Sophie. Upstairs, Sophie held Ethan close, sitting on the edge of her bed with Max sprawled protectively across her feet. The little boy tugged at his sister's locket with innocent curiosity while she whispered stories about their mother, trying to soothe her own fears as much as his. Sophie's chest tightened when she heard Melissa's voice carry up the staircase, sharp, commanding, so unlike the soft tones her mother used to fill the house with. Max lifted his head at the sound, his ears pricking, a low rumble forming in his throat. He was large even by German Shepherd standards, a muscular 6-year-old with a proud stance that had once intimidated suspects on patrol. His harness hung in the corner of Sophie's room, old and scratched from years of service, a symbol of loyalty and protection. To Sophie, that harness meant safety, and she often rested her small hands against Max's thick fur when fear overwhelmed her. Later that afternoon, Melissa entered Sophie's room without knocking. Her perfume filled the air, cloying and heavy. "Why are you sitting here? Don't just laze around," she barked, eyeing the scattered schoolbooks on the desk. Sophie, slender and pale with her brown hair tied in a messy braid, tightened her hold on Ethan. "I was helping Ethan nap," she said softly. Melissa scoffed, her sharp heels clicking as she circled the room like a predator. "Your father pays for this big house, and I'm the one making sure it doesn't fall apart. You should start pulling your weight," she ordered Sophie to sweep the downstairs hallway and polish the silverware. "And keep that dog out of my way," she added, glaring at Max, who stood firmly between her and the children, his amber eyes unyielding. Melissa never liked Max. His very presence undermined her attempts at control. By evening, the atmosphere had grown heavier. The wind outside howled through the eaves, rattling the windows, but inside the Carter house another storm brewed. Sophie obeyed her aunt's commands silently, dragging the broom across the long hallways while Ethan toddled behind with his stuffed rabbit. Max followed them faithfully, padding softly, his tail low but steady. When Sophie's small hands slipped and she dropped a silver spoon, Melissa's anger erupted. "Careless girl! Do you want me to throw you and that mutt out into the snow?" she shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she bent quickly to pick up the spoon. Max growled, stepping forward, his fur bristling. Melissa narrowed her eyes at the dog, her expression tightening with hate, but she dared not strike him. Sophie's heart pounded, torn between fear of her aunt and gratitude for Max's loyalty. Across the street, Mr. Harris leaned against the frosted window of his modest home, watching the Carter residence with suspicion. In his late 60s, Harris was a retired police sergeant, tall but stooped from years of service, his once dark hair turned entirely gray. He had lived alone since his wife's passing and filled his days by reading crime novels and sipping black coffee by the window. Harris had served alongside David once during a citywide drug raid years back, and though time had drawn distance between them, he still felt a lingering responsibility toward the Carter children. He noticed the unusual pattern of Max's barking short bursts, then silence, then a low howl that cut through the night. To Harris, it was not random noise. It was a signal of distress. The next morning, Melissa tightened her grip on the household. She called Sophie into the kitchen, where the smell of burnt toast lingered. Grace stood nervously at the counter, trying to prepare breakfast under Melissa's watchful glare. "You," Melissa pointed at Sophie, Make sure your brother doesn't cry today. I can't stand the sound. And don't think your father will believe you if you whine. He trusts me, not you." Sophie bit her lip, her chest tightening as Ethan tugged at her sleeve, sensing the tension. Melissa leaned down close, her sharp features inches from Sophie's face. "Remember this? This house is mine to run. You do what I say, or you'll regret it." Sophie's eyes widened, her small hands clutching the locket at her neck. Max moved closer, brushing against her leg, his body tense, ready to defend. In that moment, Sophie's voice broke through the silence. "Please, leave us alone," she whispered, almost inaudible. The words trembled like fragile glass, but they carried the weight of her despair. Melissa froze for a second, startled by the plea, then sneered. "Don't play the victim with me." She turned sharply, her heels clattering against the tiles as she left the kitchen. Sophie sank to the floor, Ethan in her arms, tears slipping down her cheeks. Max pressed his head against her shoulder, offering wordless comfort. Upstairs, Helen and Grace exchanged worried glances. Grace whispered, "Should we tell Lieutenant Carter?" Helen shook her head slowly, her lined face grim. "Not yet. If we cross her, we'll all be thrown out, and those children will be left alone with her." Grace lowered her eyes, guilt gnawing at her. The storm outside intensified, snow swirling against the windows, but inside the house, the storm was silent and unseen. Sophie held Ethan closer, her whisper lingering in the air like a desperate prayer, while Max stood sentinel, his amber eyes glowing in the dim light. The storm that had gathered outside seemed to mirror the one building inside the Carter house. Snow fell thick and unrelenting on the Chicago streets, piling against doorsteps and muffling the noise of the city. Yet in the Carter home, the silence was broken by the slam of drawers, the rattle of cupboard doors, and the harsh voice of Melissa as she tore through the children's room. Sophie stood frozen in the corner, clutching Ethan tightly, his soft curls damp with tears. Max, ever the sentinel, positioned himself between them and Melissa, his amber eyes blazing and teeth bared in a low growl. Melissa's once sleek hair had come loose from its pins, strands sticking to her flushed face. Her green eyes were bloodshot with anger, her hands trembling as she upended boxes and threw clothes across the floor. She was no longer the polished aunt who had smiled sweetly for David. She looked wild, desperate, undone by debts and secrets no child could understand. "Where are you hiding it?" she shrieked, her voice hoarse, pointing an accusing finger at Sophie. "Don't play innocent with me. 8 years old and already so sly you think you can trick me?" Sophie shook her head fiercely, her eyes brimming with terror. "I don't have anything," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan cried louder, frightened not only by the chaos but by the sharp pitch of his aunt's rage. Melissa grabbed the baby's bottle from the nightstand and in one violent motion hurled it to the floor. Milk splattered across the wooden boards, the bottle cracked in two. Ethan wailed, and Sophie's sobs grew louder. The sound of despair echoed down the long hallway and seeped into every corner of the house. Max lunged forward, barking with a ferocity that rattled the walls. His bark was not just noise, it was a warning, a call for protection. Downstairs, Grace dropped the stack of folded linens she had been carrying, her face pale with shock. Helen, who had been polishing the silver tray, pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "It's happening," she whispered, her eyes wide with helpless fear. They both wanted to run upstairs, to pull the children away from Melissa's fury, but fear of being thrown out kept their feet rooted to the floor. They were women who depended on this job to survive, Grace to support her struggling parents, Helen to pay her medical bills. To defy Melissa meant ruin. But they could not block out the cries. They exchanged looks heavy with guilt as Max's growls shook the air above them. Across the street, Mr. Harris sat by his window as usual, sipping his bitter black coffee. The old sergeant had seen fights, raids, even riots during his years on the force, but the sounds spilling from the Carter home chilled him more than gunfire. The dog's frantic barks, the muffled sobs of a child, the crash of something breaking each note fed the unease gnawing at him for days. Harris was tall but stooped, his gray hair thinning at the crown, his lined face furrowed with permanent frown lines earned from years of service. He muttered under his breath, "Damn it, David, what's going on in there?" But his sense of boundaries held him back. He wasn't family, just a neighbor. Still, his instincts told him something was very wrong. Upstairs, Melissa loomed over Sophie, pointing a shaking finger first at the girl, then at the crying baby. "You're just like your mother," she spat venomously. "Nothing but a burden. And you," her finger stabbed the air toward Ethan, "all you do is scream like a demon." Sophie broke then, the strength she had clung to crumbling as tears poured down her cheeks. She clutched Ethan desperately, rocking him against her small chest as she cried out, "Please, leave us alone." The words rang out with a rawness that silenced even Max for a breath. They echoed down the corridor, striking Helen and Grace where they stood in frozen guilt. The plea traveled farther still, down the staircase, into the hallway, and collided with the sudden creak of the front door. Heavy footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor, strong and steady, a contrast to the chaos upstairs. The air shifted as if the house itself drew a breath of relief. David Carter had returned. He was still in his navy blue uniform, the badge glinting faintly under the hallway light, his tie askew from hours on duty. Snow dusted his coat, melting into droplets on the fabric. His face was drawn from fatigue, but hardened now with an edge of suspicion. He had come home earlier than expected, the case that pulled him away resolving sooner than he thought. He had imagined surprising his children with a quiet evening. Instead, he was met with the sound of screams and his dog's furious barking. David's hazel eyes sharpened as he strode down the hall. Grace gasped from the bottom of the stairs, covering her mouth. Helen whispered, "Thank God." Max's barking grew louder, then ceased abruptly as David appeared at the door of the room. The sight before him made him stop dead. Sophie sat on the floor, clutching Ethan in her arms, both children trembling and tear-streaked. Milk pooled around the shattered bottle on the floor. Clothes lay scattered, the room torn apart. Melissa stood over them, fists clenched, face red, eyes wild. For a heartbeat, no one moved. David's voice broke the silence, low and cold. "What's going on here?" Sophie's head snapped up at the sound of her father's voice. Her tear-filled eyes locked onto him, and her voice cracked, fragile but desperate. "Daddy, don't let her hurt Ethan anymore." Melissa spun around, startled, but quickly straightened her posture. She forced a shrill laugh, her tone suddenly sugary. "David, you're home early. This isn't what it looks like. She spilled the milk all over and then blamed me. I was just trying to teach her to behave." David's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail. The broken bottle, the scattered clothes, the dog still tense and ready to attack, his daughter huddled like a cornered animal, his chest tightened painfully. The weariness in his eyes was replaced with fury. He dropped his suitcase to the floor, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "Enough!" he roared, his voice booming through the house. "Get out of my house, Melissa!" Melissa froze, her mouth falling open. Never before had her brother raised his voice like this at her. You're my brother," she stammered, her voice breaking. "You can't do this to me. I've been managing everything for you, holding this house together." David stepped forward, his jaw clenched, his hazel eyes blazing. "No, you turned this house into hell for my children. You are no longer welcome here." Melissa's face drained of color. For a moment she looked at Sophie, her eyes filled not with regret but with hatred. Then with a sharp turn she stormed out of the room, her heels striking angrily against the wooden floor. Max followed to the top of the stairs, barking furiously until the slam of the front door cut the sound short. In the sudden silence that followed, Sophie clung tighter to Ethan, her small body still trembling. David's heart wrenched as he reached out, longing to hold her. But she flinched, pulling back. The look in her eyes was not just fear of Melissa, it was mistrust of him. David froze, grief washing over him. He had returned home too late, and though he had driven the storm out, he realized the true damage had already been done. The Carter home felt eerily still after Melissa's departure. The slam of the door still echoed in David's ears long after she had gone, but the silence that replaced it was heavier than any storm. He stood at the threshold of the children's room, his uniform still damp with melted snow, his suitcase forgotten at the foot of the stairs. Before him, Sophie clutched Ethan as though she feared someone might tear him away at any moment. Max lingered by her side, his black and tan fur bristling, amber eyes fixed warily on David. The German shepherd's body language was unmistakable, a soldier on guard, unsure whether even the man of the house could be trusted. David raised a hand, his voice softer now, stripped of the thunder that had cast Melissa out. "It's over. She won't hurt you again." Sophie lowered her gaze, pressing her cheek against Ethan's curls, and gave no reply. her silence pierced deeper than any words. David realized then that Melissa had not only stolen his children's peace, but also eroded their faith in him. He turned away, his throat tight. For years he had believed working longer shifts was his way of protecting them, providing money, security, shelter. But standing in that dimly lit room, he saw the truth with agonizing clarity. His presence had been the one thing they needed most, and it was the one thing he had failed to give. The following morning dawned gray, the streets outside buried in fresh snow. In the kitchen, Helen shuffled quietly between the stove and the pantry, preparing breakfast with practiced movements. She glanced toward the dining table where David sat, still in his undershirt, hair unkempt, staring blankly at his untouched coffee. Helen was a stout woman, her lined face showing the quiet patience of someone who had endured loss of her own. Her husband had passed suddenly a decade earlier, leaving her to raise a daughter alone. That sorrow had made her protective of children in her care, though years of service taught her when to speak and when to stay silent. She finally set down a plate of eggs in front of him. "Sir, the children need steadiness," she said gently, her voice trembling with the boldness of honesty. "They've been living in fear. Perhaps they need to see you in a different way now." David looked up, surprised by her frankness, but there was no judgment in her expression, only weary concern. He gave a small nod. Upstairs, Sophie remained distant, barely acknowledging her father when he tried to speak. Ethan, too young to understand, cried often and clung to his sister's skirt. David made a decision that morning, a decision that felt awkward and terrifying. He would not let Helen or Grace handle everything. He would try to care for his son himself. When Ethan's cries pierced the hallway, David stumbled to the nursery. Max was already there, standing beside the crib like a sentinel, his tail twitching anxiously. David lifted Ethan clumsily, cradling him in stiff arms. The baby squirmed, his wails growing louder. "All right, buddy, all right," David muttered, though his hands shook. He attempted to prepare a bottle in the kitchen, fumbling with the formula tin and spilling powder onto the counter. Grace, slender and soft-voiced, hovered nearby with wide eyes, torn between stepping in and respecting his unspoken resolve. At last, she whispered, "Sir, the water shouldn't be too hot or he won't drink." David, flushed with embarrassment, followed her advice. The first attempt leaked, drenching his sleeve, but on the second try, Ethan latched onto the bottle. David sank into a chair, holding his son close as the boy sucked noisily, gradually quieting. A warmth spread through David's chest, foreign but soothing. Grace smiled faintly before returning to her chores. For the first time in years, the house did not feel entirely broken. Later that day, Father Thomas paid a visit. He was in his late 50s, tall and spare, his once black hair now silver, his cassock worn at the edges. He had been a friend of Anna's, the one who had officiated her funeral. His eyes, pale gray, carried both compassion and gravity. He sat with David in the library, the fireplace snapping between them. "You've fought criminals and carried the badge with honor," Father Thomas said, his voice calm. "But here, in your home, you hid. Grief is a cruel master, yet your children need not a lieutenant, but a father willing to stumble in front of them until he learns how to stand." David lowered his gaze, his hands clenched. "I thought I was doing what was right, keeping busy so I wouldn't fall apart." "And in doing so," the priest replied gently, "you left your daughter to grow strong too soon." Upstairs, Sophie sat by her window, watching the priest's car through the frost-streaked glass. She remembered his face from the funeral, the way he had spoken of her mother's kindness. She hugged her locket tightly. For a moment, she wanted to believe her father's words downstairs might mean something, but the wounds Melissa left were raw, and trust was a fragile thing. That night, Sophie woke to a nightmare, her small body trembling. In her dream, Melissa's voice echoed, accusing, cruel. She bolted upright, clutching Ethan, whispering through sobs, "Don't take him. Don't take him." Max jumped onto the bed, pressing against her side, his steady weight anchoring her. David rushed in, hair mussed from sleep, eyes wild with concern. He knelt beside the bed, his large hands hesitating before resting lightly on Sophie's shoulder. "It's all right. She's gone. You're safe." Sophie didn't push him away this time. though her body trembled in his embrace. Ethan stirred and whimpered, soothed only when David rocked him gently, humming a lullaby he half remembered from Anna's voice. His voice was hoarse, off-key, but it carried a sincerity that wrapped the children in fragile comfort. Helen, standing quietly at the doorway, pressed a hand to her lips, tears pricking her eyes. Max's ears twitched at the sound of David's voice. The dog settled, lowering his head onto Sophie's lap, as if to signal cautious approval. In that dim room, something shifted, not trust regained, not yet, but the faintest spark of hope. Over the following days, David continued his awkward attempts. He changed diapers with clumsy hands, once ending up with a soaked uniform shirt that sent Grace into stifled giggles. Instead of anger, he laughed too, shaking his head. He began cooking simple meals, the kitchen filled with the smell of burnt toast and under-seasoned soup. Sophie, sitting quietly at the table, would watch from the corner of her eye. She rarely smiled, but one morning when David accidentally dropped an egg onto the floor and muttered a frustrated curse, she let out a tiny laugh before quickly covering her mouth. It was a fleeting moment, but David caught it, his heart swelling with fragile joy. Each evening, he tried reading to Ethan and Sophie, stumbling over fairy tales, his deep voice uneven. Ethan giggled at his exaggerated wolf growls, and Sophie listened silently, her locket glinting in the lamplight. And always, Max remained present, watching, guarding, slowly easing his stance from suspicion to tolerance. One evening, as David tucked a blanket around Ethan, Sophie whispered barely above a breath, "You're really trying." The words were quiet but powerful, a small bridge built across the gulf between them. David's eyes stung with tears he didn't let fall. He only nodded, his voice husky. "I'll keep trying, sweetheart. As long as it takes." Outside, the snowstorm began to ease, the city sighing under a pale moon. Inside, for the first time in years, the Carter home carried not silence, but the faint beginnings of laughter and the fragile promise of healing. The Carter home was slowly finding rhythm again. Mornings no longer began in silence, but with the soft cries of Ethan, the shuffle of Sophie's small feet on the stairs, and Max's deep bark echoing in the yard. David had fallen into the awkward but steady habit of preparing bottles, sometimes burning his hand on hot water, sometimes fumbling with the cap, but always pushing forward with determination. The children still kept pieces of distance, but the wall between them had cracks now, and sometimes a faint smile or a hesitant laugh slipped through. On one such morning, while snowflakes drifted lazily beyond the frosted window panes, the household was interrupted by a sharp pounding at the iron gate. The sound echoed across the driveway like a threat. Max, who had been dozing near Sophie's chair, bolted up, his ears erect, fur bristling as a deep growl rumbled in his chest. David rose at once, the fork falling from his plate, and strode to the window. Outside, framed by the snow-laden trees, stood Melissa. She was not the polished woman of months ago, but a ghost of herself, her dark hair tangled, her once careful makeup streaked, her expensive coat frayed at the edges. Her eyes, bloodshot and wild, darted toward the house as she clutched the bars with trembling hands. Sophie's fork clattered against her plate, her face drained of color. "Daddy." "She's back," she whispered, pulling Ethan closer. Max barked sharply, his body taut as though awaiting command. David placed a steadying hand on the dog's head and turned toward his daughter. "Stay inside," he said, his voice firm but calm. "She can't hurt you again." He moved to the front hall, his boots heavy against the polished floor, and pushed open the great wooden doors. Cold air swept inside as Melissa's voice cut through the quiet. "David, please, please don't shut me out. I made mistakes, I know that, but I'm your sister, your blood. Don't abandon me." Her voice was raw, shredded by nights of shouting and tears. Behind her words lurked desperation. But David saw more than desperation in her eyes. He saw the same manipulative glint that had haunted his children. He stepped closer to the gate, Max at his side, teeth bared. "Melissa," he said, his tone sharp as steel, "you crossed a line in this house. There is no coming back." She shook her head violently, slamming her palms against the bars. "No, you can't do this. I raised them while you were buried in work. Without me, they would have starved. I deserve another chance." Her words, though loud, trembled with panic. Snow fell heavier, clinging to her coat and hair, making her look even more broken. At the window above, Sophie clutched the locket at her neck, whispering to herself, "Please go away." Ethan fussed in her arms, sensing her fear. Inside the house, Helen had stepped quietly to Sophie's side, placing a protective arm around the girl. "Don't watch, sweetheart," she murmured, though she herself could not look away. Just then, a figure appeared at the edge of the drive, a woman wrapped in a thick brown coat, scarf pulled tightly around her neck. This was Margaret Hughes, a neighbor in her early 50s, tall and lean with streaks of silver in her auburn hair. She had a stern but kindly face, the sort shaped by years of raising 3 children alone after her husband had been lost in a factory accident. She was known in the neighborhood for her blunt honesty and her tireless work at the local food pantry. She approached cautiously, her boots crunching in the snow. "Officer Carter?" she called, her voice steady. "I heard the shouting." David glanced toward her, surprised but not displeased. Melissa turned, eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this. This is family business." Margaret stood straighter, her breath misting in the cold air. "I've lived across from this family long enough to see the truth," she said firmly. "What you call family, others call cruelty. I heard that child's cries through the night. You're not welcome here." Melissa's face twisted, torn between fury and pleading. She turned back to David, her voice breaking. "You're going to let neighbors decide our blood ties? You'd rather listen to strangers than your own sister?" David's jaw tightened. His hand brushed against Max's collar, grounding him. "I'm going to listen to my children," he answered quietly but firmly. "And they've already told me what you did. You lost your place here the moment you made them fear their own home." Melissa's knees buckled. She clutched the bars for balance, her breath ragged. "Don't do this. I have nowhere else to go." For a long moment, David's eyes softened, memories of childhood shared with her flickering in his mind. But then he saw Sophie's pale face pressed to the window upstairs, her tiny shoulders shaking. He thought of Ethan's cries, of Max's growls of warning, of Anna's gentle voice before she died, whispering that their children must always feel safe. The softness in his gaze hardened into resolve. "Go, Melissa," he said. "This gate is closed to you. It will stay closed until you decide to change, and maybe not even then." Melissa's scream tore through the falling snow, a sound of fury and despair before she staggered backward into the street. Her figure shrank as she stumbled away, her sobs fading into the winter air. Margaret sighed, her shoulders relaxing. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "Sometimes love means drawing a line no one can cross." David nodded, his chest heavy but certain. Max's growl faded into a quiet whine, as if he too understood the moment's gravity. When David returned inside, Sophie darted to the stairs, eyes wide, searching his face. "She's gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. David knelt, pulling her into his arms. "She's gone. And she won't come back to hurt you." For the first time in weeks, Sophie buried her face against his shoulder, not resisting. Ethan gurgled between them, his tiny hands gripping his father's collar. Helen wiped her eyes with her apron, while Grace peeked from the kitchen, relief softening her features. That night, the Carter home was filled not with fear, but with the sound of small laughter. David, awkward as ever, tried cooking stew but nearly set the onions ablaze. Sophie, seated with Ethan in her lap, giggled openly this time, her first true laugh since her mother's passing. Max sprawled across the rug, his tail wagging slowly, ears twitching at the comforting noise. Later, as the fire warmed the living room, Margaret returned briefly with a basket of bread and pies. "For the children," she said with a smile, her sternness softened. Sophie thanked her shyly, holding Ethan on her hip. For the first time, David realized the battle to rebuild his family was no longer his alone. Neighbors, staff, and even Max had become part of the shield around his children. He stood at the window that night, watching the snow glitter under the moonlight, and whispered to himself, "This is their home, and I will never let it be broken again." At the end of this journey, we are reminded that even in the coldest winters of our lives, love can melt fear, and faith can heal wounds no human effort alone can mend. What happened in the Carter family was not only the courage of a father and the trust of 2 children, but also a quiet miracle. Some would say it was the hand of God, gently guiding hearts back together, showing that even broken families can be made whole again through forgiveness, honesty, and sacrifice. In our daily lives, we all face struggles that leave us weary, doubts that make us silent, and storms that seem too heavy to bear. But just as David discovered, God's grace often shines brightest in the moments we feel weakest. The miracle is not always thunder or lightning. Sometimes it is as simple as a child's first laugh after tears, a father's awkward embrace, or a loyal dog standing guard at the door. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with others, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so we can continue walking together through more stories of love and faith. And if you believe that God still works miracles today, write Amen in the comments as a prayer for your own family and for every family that longs for healing. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May He watch over your home, and may He fill your days with light and peace.